And we are just so grateful that you have joined us for our last event of this year's, the 13th Annual Vine Deloria Junior Theological Symposium. Some of you I see have been with us in previous events this year, earlier today and yesterday. So thank you for coming back this evening. And I see new names, so that's exciting. We have a wonderful small panel this evening, and I'll introduce both Deb and Patsy here in a moment. But first, as we begin our time together, I just want to do a little acknowledging of folks. I want to say thank you to the planning team who have been so diligent and so supportive as we put this piece together this year for the symposium. Some of them are in the room. We have Jennifer De Leon, who is the Director for Racial Justice, the ELCA. We have Pastor Eric Christensen, who is Dean of the Chapel and Pastor of the Community at LSTC. Of course, Emmanuel Retomosa, who is a pastor at St. Andrew's Lutheran Church, Dr. Marvin Wickware, who's a professor at LSTC, and Brenda Whitehawk, who works for the Minneapolis area, and of course myself. So just want to say thank you to those folks this evening for the work that they have done, and mostly the support as I've worked to figure out how to bring all these pieces together, which wasn't all that hard, but I'm always prayerful and of course always nervous about how we're going to bring this piece together every year. And so 13 years now of good support. Elizabeth Chintland, who is our Director of Communications at LSTC, who's helped with all the publicity, and of course, Jan Bowden, who is with us this evening, and our tech producer, if you will, along with the tech team, who is also works in public relations, leading public relations at LSTC. There are many other people who have been supportive of this symposium over the years. I would be remiss if I didn't name Reverend Dr. Gordon Straw, who was an adopted uncle of mine, and worked for the Evangelical Lutheran Church for some time, was a professor at LSCC before his sad departure as he walked on a couple of years ago, who was a great support in helping to develop this symposium over the years, and just we miss him. And so I am sure that I will have missed someone to thank, but Vine, I said in an email, I think at some point to someone, Vine is really either smiling down on us or critiquing the whole thing. So either way, we're honoring him and his legacy and the power that he brought and the medicine that he brought, not just to his studies at a predecessor body of the Lutheran School of Theology, but to the world. And so we're grateful for what he has given to us, and hopefully this is a small way that we can give back to him. We are hopeful that Dr. Phil Deloria will be presenting for us next year. We've already set dates and extended the invitation, so we will await his acceptance. So everybody pray on that. It'd be great to have Phil, his son, be a part for the first time in our 14th annual. But this is where we are, and we're excited that all of you are joining us this evening. And with that, we'll start our program for the evening, and I would like to invite the presiding bishop, Elizabeth Eaton, to begin our time together for us.
Thank you, and thank you, Vance Black Fox, for inviting me to this wonderful event. As most of, I would say, white America doesn't realize, Vine Deloria was a giant among men, and his work, Custer Died for Your Sins, maybe was the first time that many in white America began to understand the truth about the history. So I'm so grateful to be here. It's a great honor. He was an LSTC grad, I understand, as well. So just a wonderful thing that Pastor Straw helped to bring along, and Lance, that you're keeping this going. So Vance, pardon me. So thank you so much. So obviously we're gathered virtually, but we're gathered together in this virtual space from all parts of Turtle Island, connected by technology, faith, a common sense of purpose, the breath given us by the breath maker who has named and called us here, and the very piece of Mother Earth, the land that each of us inhabits today. We in the ELCA now have made a commitment and honor and understand the importance and necessity of our acknowledging the land and the original Indigenous peoples whose creation stories are rooted in these places and who have lived on these lands throughout Turtle Island since time immemorial. We also understand that all land is Indigenous land. And I acknowledge and honor that in the Chicagoland area, we are on the ancestral homelands of the Kickapoo, Peoria, Potawatomi, Miami, Ho-Chunk, and Oseti-Sakowin peoples. And we give thanks for their presence here since time immemorial. We also wish to recognize and honor all our Indigenous siblings who have and continue to call this land their home. We understand the importance and necessity of acknowledging the land and its original Indigenous peoples and doing so consistently, whenever and wherever we might gather, virtually or in person. Also, we understand this protocol is only a first step, and that as we venture into the world, we must learn more, do more, and realize healing and justice for the Indigenous peoples whose lands we now occupy.
Thank you, Bishop. So grateful for your presence here and for your willingness to and to find time. You're very busy, we realize, and so we're grateful for your presence and your openness to be here with us despite that. So thank you. We'll now start a little bit of our conversation. I'm so excited to introduce two of my friends. And I'll start by introducing Patsy Whitefoot. Patricia, or Patsy Whitefoot, just so thankful she's here. And I'll read a bit of her bio, which you can also find on the event webpage. But Patsy, this bio starts, sheltered amid the Northwest mountains and waterways, a diversity of tribes live in this unique landscape. Raised in the Indigenous homelands of the Yakama Nation, Patricia Whitefoot was raised in Medicine Valley in White Swan, Washington, by her maternal grandparents. Early education in the traditional lifeways provided a foundation that continues in her work and with her students, grandchildren, and peers. As a traditional food gatherer, Patsy is a member of the Toppenish Creek Longhouse, where tribal practices are sustained in the perpetuation of her tribe's inherent rights. Patsy advocates in support of treaty rights and tribal sovereignty through community mobilization, voting rights, health and welfare issues, civic education, and is committed to addressing the missing and murdered Indigenous women crisis. Ms. Whitefoot has served in elected positions of her tribe with the Code of Ethics Board and Yakama Tribal Council, and with the affiliated tribes of Northwest Indians, which are made up of 56 tribes, where she served as on the executive board and has served as education chair for over 25 years. I was talking to Deb earlier, and I'm just going to read this paragraph, but there is so much more that Patsy has accomplished in her life for the sake of Indigenous peoples, for Indian people here in the United States. And we're so grateful, Patsy, that you're here this evening. Thank you so much. I'm going to also read just a bit of Deb's bio here. Deb, welcome. Deb Parker, also a friend. Deb is a citizen of the Tulalip tribes and is of Tulalip, Lummi, Yaqui, and Apache descent, which extends back multiple generations. Deborah grew up in the homelands of her Tulalip ancestors, where she became innately familiar with many talents and spiritual gifts of her people. Deb has served in many key leadership positions internationally, namely as the executive director of the Residential Healing School of the, I can never pronounce this, Tsleil. You can pronounce it. Yeah, Tsleil-Waututh First Nation, where she helped create policy and healing programs for the victims of residential schools in Canada. So she's been doing this work for a long time too. Parker has served throughout the U.S., most notably as a senior legislative policy analyst in the Office of Governmental Affairs for the Tulalip Tribes. And in March 2012, she was elected as vice chairwoman of the Tulalip Tribes. After serving as vice chair, she decided to not seek re-election in 2015 to focus more on her family and continued activism in areas of education, environmental protections, women's rights, sovereignty, and voting rights. Presently, Deb serves as the Director of Policy and Advocacy at the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition, where she's worked on legislation to create the U.S. Commission on Indian Boarding Schools, and we'll get to hear a little more about that in a bit. So thank you both for being here. I am so grateful, and the rest of us are so grateful that you are indeed with us this evening. But I'd like to start. I know I've just read these wonderful portions of these wonderful bios, but Patsy, I was wondering if you wouldn't mind just kind of sharing what you've been up to lately, and some of the highlights that I might have missed. I'd like to hear a little more. I think the rest of us would like to hear more about what you've been about.
Once you've been ill, you got to rest. So this feels like nothing, but at the same time, trying to keep up with just the daily work that goes on in your home and within your family. And of course, that's very important, is, reconnecting with family as well. And I think maybe that's one of the benefits of being elders. When you become ill, then your family's going to check on you. And so, of course, I've always had my sons that have been there to support me. But beyond what you shared in the biography, I've also been engaged at the state level with making some changes with the Superintendent of Public Instruction's office. I am now a retired teacher. However, that doesn't mean I'm retired. So continuing to work with the superintendent's office to make changes, and the focus that I'm looking at is Native student identity and data accountability, because there are some challenges in how information is kept on the data classification of Native students, in not only with Native students, but with just Native people, all over the United States. As you shared, I've also been doing some work on missing and murdered. It's the same issue there as well. And so just want to continue that important work, because we're not necessarily the ones that are putting those identifiers in place, nor are we the ones enforcing it. And so I just really want to advocate for tribal control over identity of our Native people at every level of government. So that's one of the highlights. I'll start there.
Our elder here, Patsy, is very humble, and the list could go on and on. And so we're just really grateful that you're willing to share your wisdom with us this evening. And so, Deb, same question. What have you been up to, and what's going on in your world, and what are some highlights that you'd like to share that maybe I missed?
Well, first of all, Haslahel, good evening. My traditional name is Sitsialtsa, and I'm here located on the Tulalip Indian Reservation in the state of Washington. And that's the homelands of my grandmother and her family of the Stohobsh people, and also my grandfather, who is from the Lummi Nation. So it's an honor to be here. And I'm actually in my 11-year-old room here. I got kicked out because it's the evening. So it's beautiful to be here and to spend this moment with you. And I want to connect with some important work. I was able to work with Vance Black Fox, and we did some elders care packages the past year and a half, and it was We Love You care packages, and it went to we finished 1,000 boxes that went to elders across the country, and so that's very much a highlight of during the pandemic, of making sure our elders are cared for, and that's the love that we could extend. And we were able to get items from across the country: huckleberry jam, socks, medicines, teas, fry bread. And I know Vance could probably fill in a lot of those because we work together, but it was a great honor to extend our love during a time where, it's uncertainty when you're at home. What's the pandemic going to bring us? And so that's been a highlight, but mostly I'm a mother of 3 beautiful children. And so that's a whole lot of, centering in my world around that. And so it's thank you for having us. And I work for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. I'm the Director of Policy and Advocacy. So I've been there, not even a year, but I volunteered for different years. And I've also served with Patsy Whitefoot, and so she's one of my heroes. And so it's an honor to be on this panel with her as well, because I truly, she inspires me to be a better person and to continue to always work hard for the good of our nations. So thank you.
Yes, thank you, Deb. And you're absolutely right. Thank you. Well, it's one of those moments. I'm just going to be real honest, where we've heard different perspectives. Christine was with us. Christine Dendisi McLeave from the Boarding School Healing Coalition shared some things with us yesterday. We heard a little bit from Guy Irwin and how the boarding schools existed in Osage country, and then our sermon, of course, lifted up the power of the powerfulness that in the resilience of Native people as they also experienced in boarding schools, and the need for the church to respond appropriately today, and much more. And so I think we're at the moment where I just have to ask the question. And Patsy, we know that you're a survivor of boarding schools. And so I think people are, especially those of us who have been at the symposium these last 2 days, need to hear and want to hear, from your wisdom as a survivor, what that experience might have been like for you. And so thank you so much for your willingness to share that.
Thank you, Vance. I realized you got me into talking to you right away. You made me feel so comfortable. I didn't even introduce myself. So thank you, Deborah, for reminding me. So I just want to, in my language, to share who I am. Shikpachwe Inknashwanikshas Twaput Ku Pashtan Wiki Patricia Whitefoot Kutlaninam Ashanisha Boarding School Coalition. So I just introduced myself in my Yakima language, the Plateau tribal language, which expands beyond the Yakima Reservation. It expands into Oregon on the Warm Springs Reservation, the Umatilla tribe on the Warm Springs Reservation, and the Nez Perce tribe over in Lapwai, Idaho. And so language is important. And as I think about language, I have several comments just about, language as I begin to talk about my experience with the boarding school. But also place is important as well, and where you grew up and the people that surround you in your early years. In my case, I was in my, original homelands, but also with my family, particularly my grandfather and grandmother, who raised me. But as I think about my experience isn't just my experience. My experiences also include that of my grandmother, who was in the boarding school nearby where I currently live today. And it also includes my sisters who are part of the boarding schools and many other relatives. So our stories are a collective story. It's not individual. It may be that there are individual perspectives, but we all, carry similar situations, similar issues surrounding boarding schools and the role of these major institutions that, as I grew older and where I'm at today, I'm so thankful. I forgot to update you on my biography. I am now a great grandmother, so that biography must be must be outdated. So great grandchildren too, but this story extends, forward and backward to the time my grandmother was born, and it impacts the entire family. And having grown up in that household, I now know some of those impacts, whereas before, as a child, you didn't know those impacts on your life. And then moving forward with my own personal experience and the experience of family members, that I was a part of while there, I carry those memories. And today, as I look around me and being a great grandmother, I think about the people that were there. I was thinking about that today, about an individual who, she's a cousin who's no longer here, and many others. It's not just a few, it's many. but it also has to extend to the school systems where you were. And in my case, I was a part of, my grandmother was a part of the military boarding school. And so the military boarding school where she was originally a military post. And then after a few years, it became the Fort Simcoe Military School. And so as the children were literally rounded up, by just picking the children up wherever they happened to be and taking them to this installation of the military school. And so I can imagine, what may have happened with my grandmother when she was a child. I'm assuming because where we lived at the foothills of the Cascade Mountains, we had a long lane that came into our house. And so it took a while for people to get into our house so we could see, who was coming. And later those would come to be, there would be significant events around just long lanes, watching the long lanes. And so in her case, she ended up there as a very young child. And today I see various photos of the young women and the men from the military school. And there's one that's has just girls only. And I'm always looking for a photo of my grandmother because I know what she would look like. Because she would look like, she would have features of, aunties or features of sisters or features that would be clear with the grandchildren today because we tend to share, those important aspects of who we are and those features and characteristics then become a part of you too. And so her time at the military school was similar to those of other students during that time, during that era in the early 1920s. You couldn't speak your language. You were, you were washed with lye soap for doing so. And so if I had my grandmother and grandfather, were both fluent speakers, and that's what I grew up in. And so in growing up with that, it's something that you don't forget. And as I began to get older, she would talk briefly, about her experiences. She wouldn't share a lot, but I began to understand how she would respond to me. And so here I am, probably a 7 or 8-year-old girl, learning to, communicate with my grandmother. You have one way of communication, but also when you're in a school situation, I learned very early on that I couldn't trust the teachers because one time I came home and I told my grandmother that, did you know that Christopher Columbus found the United States? And she immediately hollered at me, and I never heard her respond so drastically to me. I was shocked when she hollered at me. And she says, those are damn lies. Those are lies that, the country has made up, the government and school systems have made up all of these lies. And so it's something that you never forget when you hear, in my case, she was my grandmother, and someone who never would, raise a voice. She was this very tiny grandmother, a lot smaller than me. She was like one of my probably another sister that I have just as short as her. But anyhow, to have her do that to me just took me aback. And then throughout life, then she would begin to, counter whatever I would say, which was wonderful. I mean, because that's how things came out. If I said something out of order, then I was corrected. And it has to do with the teachings that one gets as a very young child. I mean, I think about, her time at the boarding school and some of the behaviors and the way of life, my character, I think, is somewhat molded after the military. When we think about the military, it was under the Department of War. And so I'm a product of the Department of War as well, because early on in my childhood, I learned how to darn socks. I don't know how many people know how to darn socks today, but it was because it was something she learned at the military school, how to darn socks. And I was thinking one day, I bet people wear socks like only for a month and throw them away or something. But yet I hang on to my best wool socks that I can because they are important. And I know how many stitches it takes to darn those socks. And so just, they may seem minor, but during her time of life, it was how she survived, was by darning socks. Because when you begin to learn about the conditions of these barracks, they weren't places that you and I would want to live. And when you're talking about a military base, because it would be freezing, the children would be getting sick, children would die. I mean, didn't have the kind of proper clothing, supplies that were needed, particularly during the winter time. Like right now, it's snowing on the mountains here. It snows early, and we're at the foothills of the mountains. And where we are, we get the first snow of the year, which we've already had. And so they really had to be planning, for year round for the children. And yet the children were coming and going as well. And when you begin reading the accounts of the military, it's just like what goes on today. I used to be the state director for the state of Washington, and I would travel around to the various tribes in the state of Washington and the various communities, and including our urban communities. And then when I was on tribal council, it's the same thing. Many of our institutions that we have today have individuals that are coming and going. So there's never really any sustainability in the kind of work that needs to go on to address some of these issues. People come in and go. We've got superintendents that come to a reservation to add to their career. The same thing happened with the military. People were coming and going there as well. They were assigned to another patrol back east. And so it wasn't unusual for them to take off over the mountains, head to the river, and they were out of here, head to the Columbia River, and then they were gone. The same thing with public school superintendents today. They tend to move around. The other thing I've noticed too is pastors do the same thing. Come in for a period of time and then they're gone. And so really there isn't any sustainability. I didn't mean to take up too much time, but you got me going.
No, thank you so much. No, that's important, and thank you for sharing about your grandmother and the darning of socks. That part I didn't know. So we'll hear a little bit more, but from Patsy as we go on. But Deb, what was boarding schools like for you in your life, maybe in your community, and certainly we know that you worked for Healing in Canada related to residential schools. So would love to hear more about this crazy thing that we have to deal with every day in your life.
Thank you for the question. And listening, I've known Patsy since maybe I was 18 years old. Her Yakima Nation is over the mountains, and traditionally the Stohovj people, we would go to the mountains and we picked huckleberries and hops, and we played stick games. So a lot of our families were really connected to the Yakima, our dear relatives from across the mountains. So it's good to hear stories, because we weren't often afforded the stories when we were cut from stick game, from singing. And for me, growing up on the Tulalip Reservation, we had the Tulalip boarding school here, but you would have never known that it was here because it was silent. You don't talk about that school. And so I feel like I lived with a blanket over my head. And, when I did ask, I would be told that, just, we don't talk about that. And I never knew until my adult years, that it was never safe for my relatives to talk about that. And I wondered why my grandmother and others really leaned into alcohol and drug abuse, and why most of my family died young. my uncles, my aunties, they died of alcoholism, drug addiction. And, I knew that when I was younger, I was born in 1970, and it wasn't until 1978 that the Indian Religious Freedom Act passed. So when I was younger, we never got to practice our ceremonies. So my father would take us, in a car, and we'd go to a relative's house, but we were told to be quiet and not tell people what we were doing. Because if we did, they would receive, 30, 60, 90 days in jail for what they would say potlatching or singing. So we never had drums, hand drums, and we were just told to be quiet about it. And so when we went to the relative's house, they would go to where the ceremony was, but the kids would stay with a sitter at someone's house until, we'd ride our bikes and, go see what was happening at the ceremony. And, I went to church. My mom was Catholic and my father's more traditional in our traditional ceremonial way, as is my mom, but she also went to church. And so my experience was that we were told that it was not good to continue on with our ceremonies, that, it was wrong, and that believing in the way of the church or the scriptures was the right way. And so I grew up very conflicted. I loved my dad. I loved my family. My mom, she's Apache Yaqui. My dad's from here. And so I was confused. And so when my dad would practice, I would kind of be afraid for my dad that something bad would happen to him, because we were taught that was bad. And so, I grew up not understanding our history, our culture, because it was never taught in the schools, but also in the society and where we lived. They didn't, we were impoverished. So we didn't have money to go into, they wouldn't hire us in town. We didn't have the jobs. The discrimination against my mother and father were big. We received threats. And so, it was an experience that was very devastating to me. And I still struggle with understanding what happened to my grandmother, what happened to my father in the boarding schools that was so terrible that they won't speak of it. And so when our elders speak of it, I was just told the other day, I had lunch with an elder, and he just says, I don't want my grandkids to know I was sexually assaulted. They would feel ashamed of me. And it hit me in such a way that, it hit me in such a way that was painful, because we love our elders, our grandmothers and our grandfathers, and to hear that they won't speak because of the shame and guilt really hurts me. And then what stories am I going to give my children, to help so they can understand the grandparents and our connection? And, I have to relearn about our boarding school, because even as I served on council, it was it was just something we didn't talk about. It was shameful to us. So many children died in the boarding school. There were jails they put children into. And so, I think we're just in the very beginning of uncovering what happened to our relatives. And I know I'm learning daily now. And for some, it's very painful. Those stories will never come out. And for others, we can begin to listen now and begin to be supportive. We're at a time right now where trauma-informed care is real across the country. We're talking about what is trauma and how can we help support those we love, and how can we bring the truth and healing out into the open now. And so I'm grateful we're there, and I feel like I'm right there with others in this learning, in this growing. I can tell you the dates of the boarding school, I can tell you all of that, but I can't tell you what happened to my grandmother, because she died a painful death, not being able to talk about the shame and guilt she had. So a lot of our history was taken away, including the language. And and my desire to sing our traditional songs and to go to ceremonies, it wasn't until my late teenage years that we were able to without being harassed by police. So yeah, that's my early, in short, experience.
Maybe you'll say just a little bit about your work in Canada, because I think I knew you were there, but I don't think even we've had a chance to talk about what that was like for you doing the work with healing there.
Yes, I worked, I think it was in the 90s, 94, 90, 98. I worked in, hold on just a moment. Sorry, I have a little guy playing these video games. Back in I believe it was 94, 95, I worked in British Columbia for the Tsleil-Waututh Nation. And both of my children are, two of them are Tsleil-Waututh. And so they developed the Truth and Reconciliation program there. And so I was the director for the nation. And it was an honor to be able to work with the residential school survivors and to learn a little bit about what their experience was across Canada. And some of them were on the border of the Canadian-US border. So some of them attended boarding schools here in the US, but very similar stories, very similar, a lot of sexual assault, a lot of violence, death. The stories were incredibly painful to hear, but we opened those doors and we explored the truth. We cried together. We brought the children in to meet with the elders so that they could talk about those stories. And so we just really, for years, worked on how we can rebuild our own internal strength. And so it really, we started really to the core of our spirituality. And we started to the core of what's important to us, our children, our land, our language. And some of those, as Patsy mentioned, knitting socks. So we did things that, beadwork and carving and, got back to the connection with the earth and pulling canoe. And so we reintroduced our culture back to us. And it was beautiful to be a part of that process, but also very humbling. And I also felt, and I still feel, this anger inside that it was taken away from me. So going into the woods in my late 20s and going, wow, this is what the cedar tree, this is the beautiful protection the cedar tree gives us. I was just so angry and hurt that it wasn't until my late 20s that I learned that. And I had wished my grandmother would have taught me that. And I was just grateful that there was an elder who extended that teaching to me. So it was a long process, but it was such a beautiful process to heal with the nation. And I hope that the US gets to, the Canadian relatives still continue to be a part of that healing, and that here in the US, we start to open those doors to that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And it's most of the folks who might know me, who are in the Zoom room with me or with us, would never know that 3 of my grandmothers were in boarding schools, and that multiple aunties and uncles were in boarding schools, right? And I didn't even know how many until recently, because my people didn't talk about it. They lived with that shame and didn't want to pass those stories down, but also had lost a lot of those stories that you're talking about that were meant for us from our relatives, the woods, the creeks, rivers, all those things that we deem as traditional and important and are part of our identity. So thank you for sharing that, because it very, very much reminds me of what my experience has been like, also realizing or learning, what that story has been like for my family. So thank you both. Patsy, I'm curious to know, there's so few people, I should say, that don't know anything about that the boarding schools even existed. Right. Canada is so much further ahead of us, as Deb has mentioned, and educating because of the decade of Truth and Reconciliation and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. We're now kind of working on that legislation here, and we'll get to that in a moment. But we're guesstimating maybe 10% of the population in the United States even knows that the boarding schools happened, right? The Indian boarding schools happened, and the way in which they happened. That was the beginning of family separation. They practiced that on us first, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so I would just be curious to know what you think would be important for the population, or maybe even just the church. What do you need for the church and the general population to know about boarding schools? What is it that you think people need to hear, and or what are we missing?
Well, one of the things we've been doing in education, of course, has been teaching the tribal history. In our case, in the state of Washington, we do have the Indian history and curriculum that's available for our teachers. So that's one way in the public school system, and that is going on in other states. However, in other states, there are challenges being, risen up about teaching Indian history, and it's basically it's Native people who are teaching our history. And we're meeting the standards as well, the state standards, whatever standards that are out there. And so it's Native people that are doing this with the superintendent's office. And so this is going to be an ongoing issue. And so that's just one aspect of one way to begin addressing this. But, you asked about the churches. It's probably, the same thing. More than a forum, while I understand that this forum was set up by Deloria, and of course had immense respect for him and had the opportunity to listen to him personally, there's a need for a much broader, background to be done. As I was thinking about the role of the church, because that's where I was. My grandmother was in the military, and then I was in a church setting. The role of the church just really needs to take a look at itself in its own history. Because when I think about the colonization of America, people came here because they were being persecuted and they wanted freedom. And so what happened when the colonizers came here, we just were in the way. It was like we were erased from the very beginning. And, we were ostracized, villages burned, all of that, for progress in the United States. And every step of the way, when we take a look at progress, there's always going to be, those that are in the way. And so in the case of tribal people, we were basically in the way. And so we had to be gotten rid of. And I view, not just the church, but also the military for the introduction of the boarding school. When I learned more about the history of the boarding school, I really took some time to take a look at that history and begin to see, in the congressional records, the fact that all these churches took the money from the federal government. And I view both the federal government and the churches and, the various organizations that were in place at that time, being, complicit in this as well. Did you all think that, according to the papal bulls that I also took a look at, I've had to do a lot of research, that really were we the pagans here? Were we the Saracens, the heathens? That's a part of the papal bull. What were we and what are we today? And basically, in America today, we don't exist at all. It's probably far less than the 10% that you gave. American Indian, Alaska Native people, Native Hawaiians don't exist. And so, what we've done is we built allyships amongst one another and began working with one another in various, mainly civil rights organizations to help support our cause and be allies with us. When we look at all of the history and we think about, the involvement of various entities and institutions, there's been a price paid in many, many ways. When you think about whatever that price paid, a price paid by the children, who were subjected to these, I viewed it as manipulative, coercion, controlling of the churches in the way that we were taught. And I also, view this as, so who gained from this? When I looked at those congressional records and saw the amount that the various churches received, the Lutheran Church, the Episcopal Church, the Quakers, the list goes on and on. I don't have all of those numbers in front of me. So my question was, what was to gain here? Particularly when during that period of time, there were so many laws that were being put in place to really control the Indian people at that time. And as I've considered this history that I've learned, it to me began to feel like we were a pilot project. Let's just do this to these Indians and see what happens here. I mean, that's, let's put together a plan, and if it doesn't work, then we'll do something else. But this is an issue that crosses other borders. It's not just American Indian. The similar situation was going on with African Americans. American Indians were sent to Florida as well. I don't remember the name of the camp there, where they were put together with African Americans as well in a similar type of situation, to educate them, but also to maintain them as slaves at the same time. So this happened early on too. So there's so many ways to take a look at this, but I think similar to what has happened in Canada, there is the need to take a look at the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and similar to other countries that have done the same thing. But as I consider this, I also think this is going to be a long, long struggle, if it ever moves much at all, when we're talking about maybe 7% no. And maybe those 7%, it's the Indians who know. Didn't think of it that way. It's Indians, we know about it, but mainstream America doesn't know about it, because that's what our population is right now. So we do the small steps, at the state level and in our own schools, wherever tribal people have control. And we also have to think about the population throughout the United States, and where are the American Indian Alaska Natives. And of course, we know where the Native Hawaiians are. Many of them, of course, in Hawaii, but they're around, some of them are around the urban areas around, say, for instance, Seattle, where I live here in the Northwest. But we're talking about Alaska, a lot of work, as I think can learn about the stories from Alaska, there is so much to be done to address in Alaska. And then you just start going across the country and see the significance of the impact of boarding schools. I've got family in the Southwest amongst the Navajo and other tribes there, aunts who have told me how they would run away from boarding schools. And I think about, they lived in northern Arizona, and when they ran away from the boarding schools, children would walk back from, if they made it back, and depending on the time of year, if they made it back from Intermountain, Utah, back to the Navajo reservation. I mean, hundreds of miles, and children freezing and maybe not returning home. So, where is the counting of those children? I mean, when my aunt just one day shared that with me, I thought, oh my gosh, I didn't even know she was in the boarding school. And she just shared with me how she had run away. So as you can see in families, it's intergenerational that we carry these stories, amongst ourselves pretty much. But I appreciate the opportunity to share with you as well. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. That's I think a lot of folks are now a little more aware, just because of unmarked graves and the conversation, around mass graves and that are coming out of Canada, and now we're beginning to investigate a little bit here in the United States. Records are finally being found, and in the United States and as well, and not very many, right? But we know that the work's being done here and there, and so to have some of those records about children who just disappeared, right? We know they were there. We know their name was written down somewhere, right? And then let's count the graves on the ground, right? That's a whole another part of the tremendous loss and to our communities. Absolutely. Deb, Patsy mentioned kind of this policy stuff that, is happening on the state level. Certainly there in Washington for you folks, and other states are doing better at creating standards for education on Native peoples. Churches, or certain churches, Episcopal churches, both in Lutheran churches, the bishops partnered recently to put out a statement about telling the truth, the real truth, about Indigenous history, both in the church, but also in public and private school settings, educational system. And so that was pretty tremendous for us. And I will hold our church accountable for living that out as best we possibly can to support that policy change. But Deb, I know you've been working pretty hard even before you began your work at Boarding School Healing Coalition to work on the policy in DC, in Washington, DC, on the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian boarding schools. And so it would be really great if you could share what that work's like, what work's been like, and kind of where we're at. What's the state of the legislation?
Well, at this point, we have a bill that was reintroduced this year by U.S. Senator Elizabeth Warren and also Representative Sharice Davids and also Representative Tom Cole. So we have a bipartisan bill. It's called the Truth and Healing Commission on Indian Boarding School Policies in the United States Act. And so it was introduced on September 30th by Elizabeth Warren in honor of the national honoring of boarding schools in the U.S. So that was on September 30th. And the goal here is to examine what has occurred with the Indian boarding school policies, where the assimilation policies and practices inflicted on American Indian, Alaska Native, and Native Hawaiian children. We're looking at as young as 3 years old. So that's written in the policy. At first, we had the age of 5, but with our records indicate that many children were taken at 3 years of age. And so we found some stories that specifically from Alaska Native villages, a lot of the children were taken at such a young age. And I have an 11-year-old. I can't imagine my 3-year-old being taken. So that's important to note. And I think with our work through NABS, we've been able to look at the research where others have said, well, we don't have the research, or it's not cataloged, or it's, we have so many stories, missing documents that we're really asking for people to, for churches, for governments, for private agencies to come forward and bring those documents and the information forward so that we can understand this painful history. And understand how it impacts us today. So with the Truth and Healing Commission bill that was introduced, we're hoping that it will examine the policies, that it will establish a formal commission to investigate and document them. And then this includes, like I mentioned, the federal government's attempted termination of cultures, religions, and languages of Indigenous peoples, the assimilation practices, and all of the human rights violations that occurred through the Indian boarding school policies. And, this commission is intended to develop recommendations for the federal government to acknowledge and heal the ongoing historical and intergenerational trauma passed down in Native families and communities, and provide a forum for our survivors to speak about these human rights violations. So more specifically, the bill establishes the commission with representation from diverse backgrounds and experiences, including tribal and Native representatives and experts. and establishes an advisory committee, and we also added a survivors subcommittee. It also requires the commission to formally investigate and document the attempted termination of, as I mentioned, the cultures, religions, and languages of our peoples, and the assimilation practices, the human rights violations of not only American Indians and Alaska Natives, but we also have Native Hawaiians who have who went to boarding schools as well. So this is including the Native Hawaiians is a new piece to this legislation. It also requires the commission to formally investigate and document the impacts and the ongoing effects of historical and intergenerational trauma in Native communities. And we heard from a young person today speak about, well, we're happy that survivors will be coming forward, but we had a young lady say, I have a story too, just like I shared my story, that we have stories of how it's impacted us as children and as grandchildren, and how it's impacting my children. For the fear and the trauma that I carry, it gets passed on to the next generation until we heal it, until we recognize it. And so this commission will be investigating the many layers of the impact of the boarding schools. In this commission, it will require the commissioners to hold culturally respectful and meaningful public hearings for victims, survivors, and other community members to testify and discuss the impacts of these policies. And lastly, I think it requires the commission to develop recommendations for the federal government to acknowledge and heal the historical and intergenerational trauma that is related through these policies. We're looking for resources and assistance. We're looking for the resources and assistance from the federal government. We want them to provide, aid in the healing and ongoing trauma caused by the boarding school policies. And we would like the government to also establish a nationwide hotline for survivors, family members, and other community members affected by Indian boarding schools, and to prevent the continued removal of Native children from their families and tribal communities under the modern day practices carried out by, as we mentioned, state and state social service, education, foster care programs, adoption services. So our children are still being negatively, impacted by the boarding schools. So those are the areas that we're looking for in this commission. And the commission we're looking at a 3 to 5 year commission that will examine the policies. And we know that this is only a beginning, but an important beginning, an important step. And we're very, I know I was informed by Vance today that, there's a lot of support coming from the churches for this bill. So we are very pleased to walk this road with the church and with government officials who have said, yes, we want the truth to come out. We want to heal from this, and we want to make sure that this is not repeated in the future. So we are very thankful for those who have written letters and who have stood with us in this truth telling. And we're looking at the policies that examining what happened, why. It's not just one person who said, kill the Indian, save the man. This is these are institutions that believed these words and that practiced those words and that took land and that, raped, molested our children, boys and girls, at such high rates. And so we can't cover it up. We can't continue to do that. It hurts our soul. It hurts the soul of others. And for me, how can we be a part of these institutions who are responsible for this type of genocide? And so that's where we're at. And we can do this. We can do this in such a very powerful way that not only speaks the truth, but also provides that space for healing and understanding and compassion for those who have such deep pain and grief within us. And as Indigenous peoples, we know this pain so deeply because, as Patricia mentioned, our history, our family members were taken from us. They were removed from our reservations. Our languages were taken from us, and some of them will never return. Some of the languages will never return, and I can't fully speak my language because we were taught that was bad. And so all of this will be a major uncovering. I see it like a break in this. I mentioned being covered up in a hiding, and being taught to be ashamed to be Indian. And so for me, I just say, don't cover me up. I'm done. I want to share this truth, as painful and as hard as it is. I want to uncover the shame that I have. I want to uncover the shame that's been taught to me by others. And I know that we're a beautiful people. I know that we're blessed with the most greatness and holistic, beautiful understanding of why we're here. And so I'm just here to claim that. And I want my children to not be ashamed to be Tsleil-Waututh, to be Tulalip, to be, Yaqui, Apache. And so, with this, it's a commission, it's a bill, and we need the support. Senator Murkowski signed on yesterday to our bill. So we need Republican support. We need others reaching out to their legislators on the House and the Senate side. And we need to pass this bill, examine these atrocities, and stand up for the truth and allow that light to shine through so that we can begin the healing.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, Deb. And just, I'll just say one of my grandmothers, Grandma Mary, also was taken to boarding school when she was 3 in Oklahoma, right? And so that's part of our family story that we're now learning. She's since walked on, but we're all now collecting those stories as her children and grandchildren, right? To figure out how and why that happened, and also how it impacted us. So that story sharing is important, and finding pride despite it is important. Also, you mentioned the support that some churches are giving on Indigenous Peoples Day. The ELCA's advocacy office, the Lutheran Church's advocacy office, put out an advocacy alert asking Lutherans, particularly ELCA Lutherans, to send in letters urging Congress to support the legislation, the act, the bill for a Truth and Healing Commission. Over 500 letters were sent in to our representatives and senators, and so we're really excited. That's 500 letters is a good number, but in my opinion, not enough. And there's so many more that could be sent in, and a lot more things that can be done to support this legislation. Jennifer De Leon, our director for racial justice in the ELCA, just put a link in the chat for those of you who are present that takes you to, I believe, Jennifer, I think I'm correct, takes you to the similar alert that will give you opportunity to also send letters in. Share that with our allies. Share that with your congregation. Turn them into social justice seekers with us in this work we're doing to create healing around boarding school healing. So thank you for that. We also have Bishop Eaton reminds me that we also participated in a big way in Orange Shirt Day as a denomination. So we're one of the first denominations to really push that out and encourage folks. And we have flags that are hanging in a lot of our congregations now to remember the children that are being discovered and whose graves are being located, and also the children who have gone, just disappeared. So a lot of orange in the ELCA right now, and we're thankful for that, and we'll continue to advocate for awareness, but then also action. And so I think both of you know I'm the new Best Director for American Indians, Alaska Native Tribal Nations in the Lutheran Church. So I just keep telling everybody, get ready. Get ready. Get ready. We're going to be doing this work, and so I'm grateful for both of your challenges to us to join in this work, because I need others to help me tell them to do it too. So thank you for that. I guess I want to encourage folks, we're going to have a little bit of time for questions and answers here in a moment. So if you have questions and answers, put them in the chat, both here and on Facebook. You can put them in the chat there. And those will make from Facebook, those will make their way to me as well. We'll get to as many as we can. But before we go there, I want to ask both of you the same question, I guess. And both of you kind of answered, answer this question in some ways, but I want to be a little more explicit, especially for our audience who's gathered here tonight. We can write letters, and we can learn how to be allies. But I'm curious, and we'll start with Patsy. What can we as a denomination do? I mean, a lot of folks in our denomination don't remember that Lutherans were really supportive during the American Indian movement. We created the National Lutheran Board and created a granting agency and supported leaders of the American Indian movement and all their work in pretty powerful ways. There's a documentary called Native Nations that talks about that. So what can we do, Patsy, to motivate ourselves to get back to that place as Lutherans, to be supportive in this work for healing? What is your suggestion and wisdom you can offer us?
Well, first of all, I wasn't aware of that about the churches, after I pretty much decided, that's it. Particularly when you're coming from the perspective of being, brainwashed and controlled, I decided that's not for me anymore. And so went back, because in our home, we were being raised biculturally, with our traditional ways of being. As I shared, my grandparents were both fluent in our language. And so practicing our spiritual ways in the ways that we do in our Longhouse religion. And so, that was important to me early on, and have continued that. And so I'm surprised to hear that, which is a good thing. And so one of the things I want to say is then, just based on what I know, is that it would be important to share that information with those states that have Indian history, to include it in their conversations or in their curriculum that is developed, or even higher education institutions. I mean, American Indian movement was an important marker in the history. I happened to be in college then, so I was one of those that was out there protesting too, when the state of Colorado was trying to make us pay tuition at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado, and that still goes on every 10 years. Their legislature, finds out, the Indians aren't paying, but because of the treaty, Indians students didn't have to pay. And so, these higher education institutions need to know about this as well. Mm-hmm. So that's, just a starting point, I think, is important. And of course, there's the Native American Legislative Caucus that meets periodically. I think it's important for them to know. I mean, here I am. This is the first time I've ever heard of that. But that doesn't mean here nor there I'm not out and about in the business of the churches either.
Right. That's okay. There's other of us who've taken on that work. So good, bad, or otherwise, we're here. So yeah, well, thank you for that. And that's part of my role, right? My new job is to be external looking. How do we build relationships? Really, my title is a title, but I'm really responsible for Indigenous ministries and tribal relations, and so that's both nations, right, Native leaders, but also nonprofits and other policy making organizations, and so that will be part of my charge. I'll take that from you, Patsy. That I will gather a team of folks to make sure that we are educating folks about, one, our history as Lutherans and as a denomination, and what we've been about. The whole church actually needs to be educated about too. Not many folks, not many Lutherans know that we have that history either. So in general, it needs to happen. And also, reminding ourselves and partnering with those organizations so we can maybe emulate what happened in the past, not be the same, but be better even, maybe, right? Be stronger even. So thank you for that.
And what you're saying is so important. It sounds like for all churches to be on board with such an initiative, because, in our community, well, not just our community, but many communities, there, of course, is the distrust, because if, early on in our history, you were shamed for practicing your religious ways of being, and you were, ridiculed and all of that, which, I have some elders who are still here. They talk about that time of being ridiculed. And so it sounds like all the churches need to get on board.
Yeah. Well, let me start with the Lutherans, Patsy. There are certainly other folks in different denominations who do different types of work, and they do a good job. But I want us to lead that charge as Lutherans again. And so I'm also engaging other natives who are Christian in different denominations and the Catholic Church, and garnering wisdom from them, right, about what they've been about. And so it will take all of us, and there's networks of folks who are having this conversation, especially policy folks in different churches and the Catholic Church that gather on occasion. And Deb, we might, if you've not met with those folks yet, we can introduce you to those folks so you can be present with them for a meeting or more. But I will take that charge, Patsy, and I will encourage all of us to do this work even in greater ways, especially around, the truth for the sake of this healing that we're seeking. So.
Well, what you're doing is similar to what we've been doing in the States and also higher education institutions. We also have tribal liaisons. So, for instance, we have one in the University of Washington who's right with the president. We have a tribal liaison at the University of Oregon who's with the president, the University of Idaho. So these kind of positions do exist. We just need to continue to develop that. And at the state level as well, we have tribal liaisons at various state agencies too. So I'm glad the church is catching on, and we'll look for you to do amazing work.
Certainly. Yeah. And I'm reminded also that, this position, was a position that really wasn't empowered to really think about sovereignty or have the church think about sovereignty. And so now the position that I'm in really is centered in a way that gives us the responsibility of being in relationship with sovereign nations versus just ethnic ministries, and in our particular area. So building those relationships. And so maybe if you're willing, I can have another meeting with you offline sometime, so you can direct me as to where I can build those relationships and help the church do better. So,
right.
Yeah. And so, Deb, I'll ask you a similar question, right? What is it that we can be about as a denomination, ELCA or churches in general, to be better allies and to help get this work done?
Well, I think tonight is another great step. I mean, look at having Vance Blackfox as leading this. I mean, the church is in some good hands here, and having inviting Patsy, a traditional elder, and and I'm just honored to be here, working policy and just doing it the best I can, just as a human being, and just someone who really believes in our cultural ways. And I know that, to me, when we pray to that source. We pray to that, to pray to God to direct us. The work that I'm doing, I strongly believe that, when I was younger, I said, the same thing. I said, God, use me for your will. What do I need to do? I'm here, and I'm on earth, and I want to be the best human being I can. And so I think that's what this is about, is being the best human beings that we can, understanding that we're only human. We make mistakes. We can find forgiveness. We can seek that truth within ourselves, within our own spiritual path, and try and understand the history and how we got to this mindset or these belief systems. And so I'm very honored that the Lutheran Church is stepping up in this way. And as Vance has educated me earlier today, is that, the Lutheran Church has been over the years making these changes and really, trying to honor the Indigenous peoples of these lands. And so I know that with our words, and coming from, I'm a policy writer, I write law, and it's easy to That's not easy. It can be difficult, but to write law and to have the language in there and to pass laws. But as I worked on the Violence Against Women Act, and we passed it, and after these laws are put on paper, what's our action? What's our thoughts? What's our commitment to these words? And it's not just saying that, that's for someone else. It's saying, how are we collectively going to honor this work? How are we going to find healing in these spaces for people like us who matter, Indigenous peoples who have been really highly abused and hurt and devastated, and so much was taken. I know that I want to find healing not only for myself and my children and my family, but others too, others like Patsy Whitefoot, whose family members were taken away and removed. And that I'm here today because they removed my father on the relocation program, sent him to Texas. That's how he met my mother. And I asked my dad, how did you get in this relocation program? I didn't even know it was a relocation program till a few years ago. And I read something, and then he said that, well, that's where they sent us to learn. And he learned how to type. He learned these different activities. And I said, why did you go? He says, I guess I was a bad kid. If you're a bad kid, what did you do, Dad? Because my dad's the sweetest man, just a teddy bear. And he says, I don't know. I just was a bad kid. And I said, well, what about these other kids that went with you? Well, I guess we're all bad. So all of the Native kids were bad, apparently, and they got sent away. So I was like, I'm trying to uncover this, but this is it's a painful past. And why does it matter to other people? Why does it matter that we support Native people? Well, because aren't we all God's children? And I know that even though I am an Indigenous person, that seeing how other tribal, folks have been treated throughout time, I just know that that's who we should support. That's who we should help, because that's the right thing to do. And those who need it the most, highest rate of alcoholism, drug, suicide, violence against our women and boys. I believe in one study we found 86% of Native Indigenous women have been raped or molested, sexually assaulted. 84% boys. And that statistic really, it was, done by the federal government. It really impacted that. I knew women were treated poorly, especially Indigenous women, especially with our MMIW rates, the missing and murdered Indigenous women. But to see the high rate of our boys who have been impacted was really sad as well, which tells us we have a lot of healing and a lot of work to do to to really pick up the damage that we've done to Indian country. And so, what can we do? We can create more spaces like this. We can bring forward those Indigenous minds, such as Vance and Patsy. Patsy is just a beautiful leader in that, and we can continue to ask our Indigenous peoples to lead, to not just be at the table and be a number, but to actually stop and listen and learn these stories and collectively heal together. But listening is the first part. And once you listen, here's what tends to happen sometimes is that you say, oh, I know now I've heard this story, I'm going to go tell this story. No, leave that space for the Indigenous peoples. Let us tell our stories. Let us heal. Stand beside us.
I'm going to say that there's a lot that we've covered tonight. A lot of important messages that we've gotten to hear gathered here at the symposium this evening. And we have just a couple of questions. And so we'll get to a couple of questions, and then we'll close out for the evening. But I just want, before I go to that question, I just want to put in the chat link to the documentary called Native Nations. What I mentioned earlier about the Lutheran Church's history in relationship with the American Indian movement. And so so you folks have that. You can go and watch it. It's actually on the Otherwise by Nonprofits YouTube page. So just know that's a good reference for you. One of the questions, I think, is more of a clarification. Does Deb work for the Washington legislature as well as the federal government? Deb doesn't just work for them. She kind of runs the show. I'm just kidding.
A boss lady.
But you want to clarify kind of what your roles are? Yeah.
Actually, I'm the director for policy and advocacy for the National Native American Boarding School Healing Coalition. I also I've done a lot of. I was former vice chairwoman of Tulalip Tribes, so and I've also done policy for a long time, both in the U.S. and internationally. So I'm just. I guess you can say it's sort of an activist, but social human rights are important to me. Tribal sovereignty is important to me. I've also worked on many bills that have passed both in the state of Washington and nationally. So pretty excited about that. It's just I find things that are important in my life, and anything from education to the violence against women and again, tribal rights and sovereignty, health. But I pretty much, I told you, someone said, you're a do-gooder. I said, heck yes. I'm just trying to live my best life. And also I want children to have a better life in this country. I want my children and my children's children to be raised in a homeland that respects the earth and that takes care of our elders and it honors one another for our own individual belief systems. So that's a long way around what I do.
No, sure. Thank you for clarifying. Patsy, one of the questions from our friend George is what can non-Native people do to reach out to build trust with Indigenous peoples? What ways have you seen that are appropriate for non-Native people to do that?
Well, one, just introduction, just basic introduction of the work, that you're doing, I think is important. And then individuals will help to guide as well. I know that there's research that's going on and Vance, you also talked about the role of the liaison with the church. I may be saying the title wrong, but in that kind of a position, it needs to be a Native person. And all of these tribal liaison positions that are out there in the United States, particularly at the state level, at the higher education institutions, it's typically the Native people from that area. And the same thing with, the state agencies, typically people from the Northwest area or surrounding tribes. Now, I share that because when we start thinking about research, and I've seen individuals do research, and I've read research from non-Native people, you would know the person, whoever's doing the research, would come in and obtain permission to be able to do that work. In this case, it was very apparent to me that this didn't happen with this individual. She had a wonderful paper, but she didn't really gain permission. And so it's also being aware of the tribal protocols. And I shared about, making certain that these kind of positions are there for the Native people, because they're the ones that can help to set some of the records straight, and they don't have to do a lot of historical background. So you hear Deborah talking about her legislative work that she's been doing for years. I know that she's been doing that. So we don't have to educate Deborah, on some of these details, and she knows when she needs to go do the research as well. And so I think that's important. And then, I was disappointed the other day that there was a meeting that was held on my reservation, and the individuals that were providing that, I don't know what it was because I didn't listen in. I wasn't feeling well, but I had registered to listen in because I had been trying to do some research on the mission where I was, the Yakima mission, and I had periodically over the years looked for a website. And every time I went to the website, there wasn't anything there. Similar to the Fort Simpkill Military School, you really have to dig into the records. Even though it's so old, you just have to keep digging in the records. And so this workshop that was held, at a university that's located on the reservation, and it's not the tribe's university. It's kind of a Catholic-run organization, although they say it isn't. There's definitely the influences there on campus, but in this workshop, there, two individuals providing this workshop, dialogue, whatever it was, I don't know. But the fact that these were two white men that are part of the church community around the reservation, was disheartening to me. When I go to the records of this Yakima mission, and I don't see anything there, and then to have an individual get up and talk about it and someone who comes in, and I think I might have said that here or somewhere else, individuals coming in and then individual leaving, no investments in the community. And so what is this history that this individual knows about, where I was, where my early childhood was spent? And so two white men telling us, I'm certain that there were Native students in the audience, and also people, low-income people who live around the Yakima reservation. So that's very disheartening, to see it. I'm pleased that Christine was on this call, but I don't really know what happened with it all. So, you look at those kinds of things and who's presenting this information. And like I said, it just simply takes an introduction, with your key leaders in the community. And while I might live in White Swan, that doesn't mean I don't have relatives in other parts of the reservation. We are probably the largest reservation in the Western states. It's a simple phone call or a simple text to someone to say, now, who is this character and where did this character come from? That's what I'll usually ask my sisters or my relatives. Now, what's he got to do with being here? That sounds like the kind of conversation I would have. What's his business and how long does he intend to be here? Anyhow, yeah, just that too, is similar to any other kind of roles that are part of our community. Sure. And so in later years, I've tended to watch the church people before I used to watch the superintendents. Now I'm watching the church people because I'm trying to learn. I mean, at my age, I think I can still have some learning in me to do.
Yes, we all do.
I don't know anything about the church.
Well, we're certainly glad that that's the case, and let me know if you want some help. I've been trained from a very early age, Christianized for generations. And this is where I am. And so I'm happy to help. In fact, just let me say that I am so grateful. And we've come pretty much to the end of our time. And so we could have this conversation forever. And in the times that we've seen each other, Deb, Patsy and I, and others, we can sit in the hallways of different conferences and just have these conversations and laugh and giggle and tease and all the things. And in those places, right, is where a lot of my healing has happened, where other folks have, like my friends here who have been present in my sorrow and sadness, who have grace in around my frustration and anger. And so I'm just really grateful, Patsy and Deb, for you being who you are in any country, for not just me, but for so many people. And so your power and your medicine is needed. And we are just so grateful that you took some time to be with us this evening at this symposium. Deb did put in the chat the boardingschoolhealing.org website, just so you know, they're having their conference tomorrow and Saturday. They did us the favor of not using the same dates as the symposium. So it's a pretty powerful conference. I've gotten to be at all of them and to help support those and to help grow it in the past when I worked for Boarding School Healing Coalition. So I'm so excited about what's going to be happening these next 2 days. Go there now and register. It is also a free event. And so take your time to check all that out if you have really desire to learn more from other survivors and other folks who are doing this work, including Deb. So Deb, thank you for taking time this evening, the eve before you really have to do some hard work these next 2 days. So thank you.
We have a great lineup for the 2 days, and I personally want to thank you for the invitation and to spend this evening with those who, came to learn and to be a part of this healing and this movement. And I have to give a shout out to our Auntie Marlene Haglemo. She is the light of a lot of this work too, and she gives me the hope and inspiration. So I know the church, that's two good representations of folks that I know on this walk of healing. So just want to acknowledge Auntie Marlene and love you. And yeah, so I mean, there's so many good people on our path here, and I know that we will heal together. And I'm excited to see you on the screen here, and I hope that I get to see you in some travels and hopefully read some letters of support for our legislation.
That'd be great. That'd be great.
Thank you.
I like that charge and invitation. There's one last thing, one last question. Tim Leitner, I believe that's his last name, asked if there's resources. Yes, go to boardingschoolhealing.org. There's tons of resources. There's a curriculum there. There's a lot of a list and database of resources that you can find there. You can find the map and the list of the schools that have been researched so far. So just on that list, you'll see evangelicals. That's actually Lutheran. So just note that as you go through that material. So that'd be the place I send you first. I'm sure that at some point when I find a little more time, I will be also doing some classes for our church and offering resources in a different way, as well other leaders in our church that have been gathering to do this work inside the denomination at a pretty rapid pace so far. So just know that Tim and others go there to check it all out. Again, thank you to both.